Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to come down. It's been an interesting couple of meetings. Good turnout today, good turnout yesterday. Southern California, I think we probably had about 100% participation of dairy farms in the area and had all 30 producers there. So definitely, it's interesting to me. When I started with the department 30 years ago, over 30% of the milk in the state was still coming out of that Chino milk shed. Definitely a much different picture as I drove around that area yesterday or Wednesday, I guess. Thank you. So as Maren said, my role or purpose for coming here today is to explain the two different paths that a petition process could go down. The reason there's two different paths is that there are multiple chapters in the Food and Ag Code where milk law is put in place. There's Chapter 1, which deals mostly with paying for manufacturing milk. We won't talk about that today. Chapter 2, which had to do with establishing prices for market milk. That was the chapter that gave us authority to have the stabilization and marketing plans. Those have been replaced by the federal market order. Chapter 2.5 or 2.5 deals with the Milk Producer Security Trust Fund insurance program to protect you, the producer, from non-payment by handlers. Chapter 3, which is the original Milk Pooling Act that allowed for the pooling of milk revenue here in California and the issuance of quota. And lastly, Chapter 3.5. Chapter 3.5 was added late in the game. Relatively speaking, it was added in 1993. It established the $1.70 spread between the quota price and the non-quota price. And so those two chapters, last two chapters, Chapter 3, which again is where quota was issued, established the original pooling plan, and 3.5, which gave the department the direction to have the $1.70 spread. Those two chapters are what I'm going to focus on today. Both of those chapters have language in them that describe and allow for a petition process and a hearing process and possibly a referendum to take place. Again, as was mentioned earlier, it's kind of confusing, but that's the way the law was written. So we have two different chapters. I'm going to dive right in. Those of you that endured the first presentation I gave in Southern California, you got to enjoy me reading code. I'm not going to do that today out of the trying to be mindful of time. But in Chapter 3.0, the code section I just had up, and this code section are the code sections that talk about the petition process, hearing process, referendum process. Here's some additional part of that last code section. Pretty lengthy code section. I'm not going to try and take it all on in one bite. Break it down here a little bit. So this is the same code sections I had on the last two slides, but just pulled out select portions of that code section. So what I want to point out is in Chapter 3, the Secretary may amend a plan, but she can only amend that plan after a public hearing. So the public hearing is a crucial part of the process. So how do we get to a hearing? There's a couple different ways we can get to a hearing. The director may have a hearing on her own motion. So that's down here. The hearing may be held on her own motion so that the secretary at any point could say, hey, I'm going to hold a hearing on this QIP plan, and we're going to listen to you, the industry, interested parties, hear their testimony, and decide what to do with the plan based on that testimony. A petition can be held by any one individual interested party, send in a petition or a recommendation or a request to the director saying, hey, I think that we need to have a hearing and here's why. She could accept that and say, yeah, good idea, we'll have that. Or she shall call a public hearing if she receives a petition that is signed by not less than 25% of the total producers that produce not less than 25% of the total production of all milk in the state. And so Craig was up here earlier talking about their efforts to get the petition circulated and signed, and so that's a threshold that they are trying to meet in gathering those signatures. So if we get those signatures in, we go to a hearing based on that public hearing. At this point, based on what we have here in the language, what can the secretary do? Well, she can decide I'm not going to do anything at all because things are going just fine based on the testimony. She can terminate the QIP, and in here it talks about the director may terminate the plan and talks about some thresholds or things that she has to decide in order to do that. She can amend the plan, so she can make non-substantive amendments if she wants to without going to a referendum. So here, after the hearing, the director may make non-substantive amendments. She doesn't have to go to a referendum. If she wanted to make substantive amendments, we would, under this authority, have to put that out to a referendum of you, the producers. So that's all well and good at this point, right? We get that 25%, we have to go to a hearing. The legislature was pretty clear at what we have to do. If we get that 25%, not only do we have to go to a hearing, the language also says if you get that 25%, we have to go to a referendum. So the director shall submit the termination of the plan to a statewide referendum. Again, we'd still have to go through the hearing, but we would have to, again, there's that shall word, shall submit the plan for termination upon receipt of a petition requesting termination by 25% of the total number of producers and 25% of the milk. So 3.0, get that petition, 25%, we have to go to a hearing, also have to go to a referendum. Another thing, important distinction of Chapter 3.0, again, we're still talking about Chapter 3.0, is the vote count. If we had a referendum, the code tells us what basically the petition has to ask. Do you want to continue this or do you want to terminate? And so 3 things have to happen. First, at least 51% of producers have to submit a petition to us. Those petitions not a petition, a ballot. We would mail ballots out to you, the producer. It would say, here's your producer number, your name, address, here's your milk volume that was reported to us, and here's who reported it to us. So based on that volume, on that ballot, you check yes or no, sign it, send it back in. We start tabulating. We have to receive at least 51% of those ballots back, and one of 2 things has to happen down here. 65% of those voting have to vote yes, and those 65 have to produce at least 51% of the milk that was represented in that vote. Or, if you don't have 65% of the number of producers, if you only had 51% of the number of producers, and those 51% produce 65% of the milk in the vote, then the ballot would pass. So this is what we often refer to as a supermajority. That type of vote is used very often in the marketing orders. One thing I didn't touch on earlier is that important distinction, we're not part of the Marketing Act. That we've been mistakenly thought to be a part of a marketing order. We're not. It's a separate standalone legislation. The important part, though, coming out of 3 is this vote count. You have to have the supermajority, and we would be required to go to referendum if we had that 25%. The next chapter, Chapter 3.5, Chapter 3.5 initially was put in place to establish the $1.70 spread. The legislature put that chapter in 93 and said, Department, you will announce a $1.70 spread between the quota price and the overbase price when you announce those pool prices, and you're going to do it until the producers no longer want you to do that. And so in that chapter, there's language, again, that says that, and I'll get to that next slide. But next important thing is the language that was added to the Food and Ag Code that gave us the authority to have the standalone quota program, Food and Ag Code Section 62757, was added into Chapter 3.5. Again, initially put in place for the $1.70 spread. When it was put in place, the legislature said, well, here's a process you have to go through to establish the QIP. If you're going to establish it, go to the producer review board, talk to the review board about how this program should look. If you're going to implement it, put it to a vote of the producers. And it said, we're going to point back to Chapter 3.5, or excuse me, 3.0. So when we implemented the QIP, per the legislators' direction, we used that supermajority vote when we were tabulating the QIP. Again, staying in 3.5, what was also included in 3.5, as I mentioned earlier, was language that says that this chapter will remain operative until the Secretary certifies that the producers have voted in a referendum to suspend the operation. So the legislature envisioned a time when you, the producer community, may want to suspend Chapter 3.5. And the legislature gave us direction, said that the Secretary may, again, there's that term, may versus shall, may hold a public hearing at any time to consider whether this chapter shall be suspended. So again, she can do it at any time based on her own motion. Any one interested party sends a letter in and says, hey, we want to have a hearing. She says, great idea, we're going to do that. Or she shall hold a public hearing to review a petition. So there's that shall word telling us we have to do it if we get a petition signed by not less than 25% of producers who produce not less than 25% of the total milk. And so this is what Craig is referencing, that they're shifting their focus and using the authority here to try and get that 25% to require that hearing. So the next important distinction between Chapter 3 and 3.5 is that in 3, you may recall, I hit the next slide that said, if you get that 25%, you have to go to referendum. That language doesn't exist in Chapter 3.5. The only thing that 3.5 requires us to do is to hold that hearing, but then it does talk about the referendum. So it doesn't say you have to go to referendum, but you do have to hold a hearing. The Secretary shall, if we go to a hearing, the Secretary shall establish a 60-day period to hold that referendum, and she can extend that for an additional 30 days. So basically, if we weren't getting enough votes in place and the Secretary wanted to allow more time for votes to come in, she could extend that voting process. So the legislature, again, they kind of tell us how we have to do things. The ballot, if we go to a referendum, is going to look basically like this. As I mentioned earlier, we would send this ballot out. It would have a statement on there of your total production. We would include it on the ballot we sent out to you, showing how much milk was reported to us and who reported it to us. This is a more interesting section to cover. The vote threshold is much different in Chapter 3.5. So if we've gone to a vote in 3.5, first thing I can start, we'll go to this in a second, but first thing is, what has to happen? Well, in order for the QIP to stay in place, the producer community has to vote to keep it, not to get rid of it. So the ballot would be, do you want to keep Chapter 3.5 in place? The Secretary shall find that if a vote favorable to continue the operation of this chapter has not been given, the Secretary shall so certify it at the Secretary of State and shall declare this chapter, again, the entire Chapter 3.5, which includes the authority to have the QIP, would be suspended. So this is where we get the notion or the direction that if you don't vote to keep it, it's gone. What do you have to do to vote to keep it? A few things have to happen. what's required. First, we have to get at least 51% of eligible producers to vote, and that's right up here. Not less than 51% of total eligible producers in the state have voted, and at least 51% of those voting have to vote yes, and of those voting yes, they have to produce at least 51% of the milk included in that vote tabulation. So again, to keep it, you have to vote to keep it. You have to have 51% of producers eligible, participating in the vote, at least 51% of those voting yes, and they have to produce at least 51% of the milk. Much different than the supermajority vote that is spelled out in Chapter 3.0. If the chapter does not continue, then what happens, the legislature said, if it doesn't continue, then we revert back to the pool plan that was in place December 31, 1993. The calculation of the pool in 1993 was driven entirely by class prices. It doesn't talk about that 19.5-cent additional price or additional revenue to quota producers. It just talks about how we're going to divvy up those class prices in the pool. Without any class prices being announced by the department, we really wouldn't have any way of calculating a quota price or any kind of a pool price. And that's it. So the takeaway that I came down to discuss, again, two different authorities. Chapter 3.0 requires a supermajority. It also ties our hands as a department and requires us not only to go to a referendum, or excuse me, a hearing, but a referendum if we get those 25%. And that's in contrast to 3.5, which only requires us to go to a hearing, but if we do go to a referendum, then the lower threshold of the 51%. And with that, we'll do our Q&A session.
Actually have two microphones working well this morning, and I understand that the camera only captures between these two tables there. So Don, if we can.
No, you stand there. I'll stand here.
Okay. All right. So I guess we'll do this standing up this time. Stand-up comedy. Okay. These little Post-it notes or note cards, if you have them, and if you have a question, please write the question. Please write very neatly. I didn't ask some questions yesterday because I couldn't read them. So I would like to be able to read your question. And then pass them off to Matt. They will pass them off to me, and then I'll be asking the questions here. Donald, can you walk us through the timeline? So let me give you this scenario. Let's say that it's the farm show next year, February 15th. And let's say that we went through this process and we were not able to reach a consensus. And just as a thought experiment, let's assume that on February 15th, 2020, the Stop Quip files the petition under Chapter 3, the 65% petition, right? If you could walk with me through the timeline, what happens first, how long does it approximately take? So I assume that the very first step after the petition is received on February 15th next year would be to validate the signatures, right?
That's correct.
Could you spend just a few sentences talking about the process of validating the signatures?
So when we get the petition in, we look at the list of producers that we have in the milk pooling database, and we will also cross-reference that with a list of dairy producers that we have in the milk and dairy food safety, so the folks that issue the grade A permits. I'll look at the names that we have in the two of those, make sure that we're both on the same page as far as grade A producers in the state. Once I get those two lists reconciled, then start comparing the signatures and names that we have or that I received on those petitions to those lists that we have both in, again, milk and dairy food safety and in milk pooling or the QUIP program. When I'm looking at the signatures for a dairy farm that owns quota, I go straight to the producer's folder and look to see who is registered as the owner of the dairy. The law requires that whoever owns a dairy, the quota has to be registered in the name of the producer, same people that own the dairy. And so if your dairy has quota assigned to it, I will use that quota certificate and the quota registration as my control, if you will, for the signatures that we accept. For the dairy farms that don't have quota, we have the list of names that usually the handler will submit to us saying, hey, we got a new dairy farm starting. This is the list that we have as the owners. And then Milk and Dairy Food Safety, they usually have the same names. So I'll look at the names that we have from those two sources and use those names as well. So that's, from there, once I get that, then.
And how long could that process take? You know, just your best guess. We won't hold you to it.
So that process actually was the lengthier part of the process the last time around, because we hadn't spent as much time reconciling the list between Milk and Dairy Foods and ourselves. And so for me going through that took me 2 to 3 weeks just to get through that. It's a very cumbersome process to going through manually and comparing and contrasting. So, but what I have done since then is I've been keeping track of the changes that we've received. So it wouldn't be as lengthy a process, but still, you know, at least 30 days to get through that.
So now we are in March 15th, and for the sake of the thought experiment, let's assume that there, even if some signatures are discarded, there's enough signatures, there's a 25% threshold is met. And again, a reminder, we are under Chapter 3, right? So we are now March 15th. What is the next action that the Secretary of the CDFA will take at March 15th? Then?
So the Secretary would have to, at that point, call for a hearing. It doesn't really say what kind of a time frame you have to have. It would be public hearing process. We'd have to give, per law, an Open Meeting Act, we have to give at least 10 days notice. But most likely we'd give a little more lead time just for the logistics of everybody's scheduling and getting a panel in place and getting everything set up. It could be a lengthy process. But
when you say panel, that is you and someone else from CDFA taking notes, or what does that mean?
That I can't speak to for certain. In the past, when we've had public hearings, it's been departmental staff on those, but I don't know that we're required to have only departmental staff.
Okay.
I know there are hearings at times where you have industry people sit in on those, but yeah, so I'm not sure what our legal restrictions are.
And then, you know, let's say that a meeting were to take place in this room. How is a public hearing different than a meeting that we have here this morning?
Well, so the meeting here obviously is not a legal meeting or not a part of the state government. So you can get together and talk about whatever you want, however you want. You don't have any restrictions. When we have a state meeting, the law requires the Open Meeting Act. We have to put out the agenda, put it out so many days before, and then whatever item is on the agenda, the board that's holding that meeting, they can only take action on those agenda items. They may be able to discuss some other items that are not on the agenda, but they can't take any legal action or formal action on those.
Okay. And then let's assume you would hold, what, 3, 4, 5 meetings through the state, or?
Well, we wouldn't have to hold hearings, we wouldn't have to hold meetings before a hearing. If we went to a hearing, we would announce a hearing.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
We may have what we historically have called a pre-hearing workshop, where we set something up ahead of time and say, okay, everybody, you want to come in and kind of throw out on the table, here's what I'm going to propose and here's why. You don't necessarily have to participate in that process.
But would hearings take place throughout the state, or is it just in Sacramento?
Usually we've just done it in Sacramento.
Just in Sacramento?
Yeah.
Okay. And so now we're sometimes in April 2020, right, doing hearings. Would that be a process that's completed by May 1 or June 1? Help me understand.
Again, there's not a set time frame. Once we call a hearing, then there's like a 60-day to completion process. But it's the upfront part, there may be some flexibility, as to when that first hearing or when the hearing is scheduled.
So let's say July 1 would be the end of the hearing. Would that be a reasonable
Yeah, I mean,
reading
yeah.
of what you said? Okay, and then is there a transcript produced at that? Is there?
There is, when we have public hearings, we have a court reporter, and she will record the hearing, and then that transcript is usually available about 10 days later, and
So that's okay. So let's say that we're now July 15. The transcript is done and everything is done. What happens next? And the reason I'm asking openly is because you told us a few minutes ago that there is a restriction in Chapter 3.5 that the Secretary has to call for a referendum. But she has also issued a document where she spells out the process that calls for a PRB meeting, discussion on the. So what happens after July 15th?
so, correction, the 3.0 requires a referendum.
We are still in 3.0, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so 3.0 requires a referendum. Within the QUIP itself, there's authority to request a amendment or a change to the QUIP. If the request came in under the authority of just the QUIP, we would follow the recommended procedures that we have set out
But
in
if
there.
it came from a petition, 3-0 petition, the 65% petition?
We could still go before the board, and we probably would call a board meeting and say, hey, board, here's a petition that came in, discuss, make your recommendation to the secretary. Again, very important distinction. The board makes a recommendation to the secretary. Their recommendation is not binding. She can say, thank you very much. You said turn right, we're going left. She has that
But in this
flexibility.
case, she actually has to turn left, right? The Chapter 3 specifies that she has to hold a referendum. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So now we are August 15th, would you say, or September 1, after the consultation with the board is done? And
I would envision that a consultation with the board would probably take place prior to a hearing.
prior to the hearing?
Yeah.
Okay.
You
Okay.
know, this is new ground for us, this whole, once
Yeah.
we have voted out the existing system, went to the federal order, life is different.
Yes,
And,
yes. So then maybe sometimes August 1, September 1, we would have a formal call for a referendum issued by the Secretary?
I don't think it would be that long.
So maybe even July 15th?
Yeah.
Okay. And that would consist of a ballot being sent to all grade A producers,
So,
or?
yes, if we had a referendum, we would look at who has submitted, no, not who submitted, we'd look at who's had production reported to us by all the handlers in the state. Their production has been reported to us, so we would send a ballot out. Here, whatever your dairy name is, here's your milk production, here's where we have it listed as going to, and then they could send it back. And so we use a ballot that we have sent out. We know it went to the right address that we have on file. has
And
the
that
right
was
production.
90 days last time, or 60 days?
It was initially 60 days, and it was extended another 30 days.
So it was 90,
Yeah.
right?
We had enough signatures at that 60-day time period
Okay.
to implement the QUIP, but we still had the additional 30 days. It was
So July 15 to August 15, that's 1 month. September 15, second month. Let's extend it for another 30 days. Now we are on October 15th, closed. The referendum is closed. What happens then?
At that point, then we start counting ballots, and actually we start entering them into a database before the end of the 90 days. So at the end of 90 days, we would allow time for the mail to come in, probably give 10 days for the mail to deliver, and then have a tabulation at that point, and then run it up to the secretary and say, here's the count, here's where we're at, and then make an announcement as soon as we could after that.
So if the referendum is closed on October 15th, would you say November 1 is a reasonable timeline to have the final count prepared for the secretary? And, and when could the dairy community hope to expect that she would issue a final ruling based on the count, or report the count?
So her final ruling would come out when the count came out.
Oh, at the same time.
Yeah.
So, and just for the thought experiment, let's just say that the referendum to terminate QUIP did pass. Would the QUIP be terminated immediately? Would it be after a few months, or how would that work?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay,
right offhand.
but sometimes before January 1, it would probably
Yeah.
go away, right? So we could potentially find ourselves January 1, 2021, QUIP gone. Is that, based on everything that we've gone through, that's a reasonable?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And the reason I go through all of this is because we didn't do this in other two meetings. I think it was useful for you to set the timeline expectations. Now let's do another thought experiment with 3.5. So we'll start with the same February 15th. February 15th, the 3.5 petition comes in. A reminder, that's a petition where only 49.1% of producers need to vote to discontinue Chapter 3.5, and then QUIP would be discontinued as well. Correct me if I summarized it incorrectly. So February 15th, the referendum comes in. We go through the same process of validating petition. We are in March 15th, right?
Yep.
And then we do the same public hearing, which takes us to, what did we say before? Was it July 1 through public hearing? And then an interesting thing happens. After the public hearing in the previous petition, the Chapter 3, she would have to go to a referendum, right?
Correct.
What happens here July 1 when the hearing is over under Chapter 3.5?
So she would announce her decision saying, based on the testimony received, here's my decision, here's what we're going to do. And again, it could either be, Chapter 3.5 is functioning the way it should, the way we envisioned it. I don't see any reason to terminate it, so we're just going to keep on keeping on. Or she could say, based on the testimony received, I think it should go to referendum, and then she would establish or tell what the referendum start date was, and go from
And
there.
then the
Yeah.
same process. And then I think it's also important to understand that if we do go to a referendum, what happens if everybody stays home? Not a single ballot is submitted.
Nothing would change.
Nothing would change on the 3.5?
I'm sorry, under 3.5, if she said we're going to a referendum, she's at that point saying, okay, the producers sound like they don't want this. The way the law is written, you have to vote to keep it at that point.
Right.
And so if nobody shows up, then that entire Chapter 3.5 would be suspended,
Including QUIP.
including the authority for QUIP, yes.
So under Chapter 3, 65%, we have to go to a referendum. Everybody stays home, nothing changes, right?
Correct.
Under Chapter 3.5, we don't have to go to a referendum. It's up to the Secretary Ross. But if we do go to a referendum, if people don't vote, the QUIP could actually go away, with 0 votes, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. All right, so a lot of questions that we've received here in the first batch that I was reading while Don was explaining this asked whether the Secretary has to go to a referendum. It depends on the type of the petition submitted. The 65%, you have to go to a referendum. The 51%, it's up to the discretion of the Secretary. And I hope the timeline here helps that, one way or another, by the summer or late summer 2020, you would know whether you're in a referendum or not. If the February 15th is the farm show is the sort of the cutoff for consensus or no consensus. Appreciate that. There was a question that was asked before we had the federal order. How was quota paid for back then? Was it paid by the producers or the processors?
It was paid by the processors. The entire pool revenue that we redistributed through our program, through the pooling program, that was all minimum price monies that were paid by the processors to the producers. So it's your money as producers in one kitty. All we did was redistribute that money based on how much quota you had, how much base over base.
Okay, but if we had a referendum to discontinue quota but keep the state order, is it correct or not correct that some producers would see their prices increased if the quota went away?
I'm sorry.
Let's say that we're in a state order, but
if we were in a state
discontinue
order,
quota,
okay.
would some producers see their prices go up?
If quota would have been eliminated under the federal system?
Under the state system.
Under the state system, the over base price would have gone up about close to 40 cents a hundredweight.
Exactly the point of that question. So the question was, how was quota paid for, who paid for quota before the federal milk market order? Don just answered it was not us as producers, it was in fact processors.
Yeah, and if the quota was discontinued, some producers would see the higher prices.
That wasn't part of my question.
That was my question, actually. Yes. Okay. So. That's. A lot of questions that we've received are outside the authority of Don and his administrative powers, so I'm going to skip it here. And I guess there was one question, Don, that is legitimate. Oh,
That-
no,
We have a petition, you're saying it's not required, which I disagree with you on that, that's all right. If we have 300 people come in to the hearing or sign a petition that desires to have the industry decide the question, what do you think her reaction would be to that?
I'm not going to speculate on that, Craig. But she has, as I've mentioned before, she has been very much interested in you as a producer community to decide your own direction, your own, whether you go to a federal order or not, and decide your own fate. I'm not going to speculate what she would decide. You heard the discussion or the comments of Michelle Diaz at a prior meeting. She's interacted with the secretary quite often, and so I think that you heard her speculation. I'm not going to speculate.
So we will have another webinar on Monday morning. Some of the questions that were asked here today, I will take these cards with me and we will prepare them for our Q&A on Monday morning. So the interest of time and efficiency.
I think there's an important question that came over here, and I think we got a confusing answer. So I think we need to clarify here.
Okay.
The question was who was paying for the quota program under the state system, and technically, your answer was the processors pay into the pool, that money's then distributed based on quota or non-quota.
Yeah.
But processors did not pay a higher price in order to solely fund the quota program. They paid the class 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on which class they were buying. It was the producers that then agreed to a quota program that distributed some of the money to the quota holders and the remaining to the overbase. And to Marin's point, if there was no quota program, it would not have lowered the processors' obligations to the pool. They would have paid exactly the same amount into the pool. It just would have been spread evenly over the overbase. So my question is, did I say anything inaccurate here?
No, and so if you go back to the original pool payout where we had a variable spread, the quota producer, the first pools, all the class 1 price went only to quota producers. And so that was kind of the political trade-off to get anybody that owned quota to go into and be in favor of a pooling system. And so at the onset, class $1 only went to to quota producers. When we went to the $1.70 spread, the class 1 price was enhanced. Everybody benefited under that $1.70 spread because there was more money thrown in the pool with the $1.70 spread. That enhanced class 1 revenue got shared amongst everybody, as opposed to the old system where class 1 monies only went to quota milk. So you all across the board benefited for a number of years. Overbase producers for a lot of years were much better off with the $1.70 spread system than it would have been under the variable spread. It wasn't until we, as a department, enhanced the weigh factor value in the formulas that you started to see that had we had the old system in place, versus what we had in $1.70. The overbase producers would have had a little bit more money. As we adjusted Class 1 price up and down, 4B price up and down, it changed that dynamic as to what way that money would have flowed. But again, it was all class price revenue paid by processors into the pool and then redistributed based on quota base and overbase.
I'm going to ask you, Stephanie, to speak with Don in the break. On the side, we are at 11 o'clock. Don and I will continue, Don and I will continue this conversation on Monday morning. We have another 2 hours to go through. We have 11 proposals to go to. You guys have a weekend to go to after this. So let's thank Don for his participation here this morning. We'll take a short 10-minute break, and then we will continue with the proposals.